think of royal history and things like that, as I've often said here to all of my chums on this wonderful channel, we do think about the most scandalous things, don't we? It always springs to mind like Edward and Mrs. Simpson, you know, the sort of thing, because they're in our time. And you sort of think, wow, you know, is that what really happened? I remember, I'm sure many of you know because I filmed a little bit of it, was going to the flat, literally just off Edgware Road in London, where Wallis Simpson lived and where she was visited by the then king. And, you know, for me, I'm looking and thinking, is this it? Because obviously when you look at glamorous locations, don't get me wrong, it's a very glamorous set of apartments. But back in those days, that would have been kind of not the most glamorous area, particularly for, you know, to live. But of course, Wallis Simpson wasn't that well off at that point, doing well, but not literally royal well. That's the thing. And when you do look at situations, you realise exactly now how they rewrite history. And we saw that none more so when you think about The Crown, the Netflix show. As I said at the start of that, they came to the studio to make some of the promos. And I remember the two stars, you know, Matt Smith, I forgot the lady's name now, but anyway, they came along and lovely people. And I said, what's it about? And they said, oh, it's, you know, just about royalty. They really played it down, you know, we'd not seen any tapes. So all I really had was the, you know, to just interview them about it. And they were just really nice people. He, of course, was famous for being in Doctor Who. So obviously I knew a little bit more. Of course, then when The Crown came to fruition, you think, well, this isn't true and that's not true. And of course, Peter Morgan had stretched the truth beyond all recognition because he was creating a soap opera, a beautifully made soap opera, but no different to Dallas Dynasty, Knots Landing, anything like that. Literally outlandish claims that were never true. But then they became part of the folklore because if you didn't know your royal history, you believed it, right? And this is a story that apparently Netflix are now toying with right now. As ever, let me explain. Good to see you, chums. Thank you so much for your time. It's always nice to have your company. And to share these nostalgic videos is even more exciting for me because, as many know, that's one of my passions. It's, you know, I love all of that. I'm always fascinated about certain areas, particular doorways, you know, where people lived, what they did. And correct me if I'm right about this, but or wrong should I say about this, but when you go to visit somewhere, say it's been a big event in your area, your town, and that person lived there, it always looks less glamorous than what it looked like on the TV. You know what I mean? It's not the same, is it? Because you suddenly think, oh right, this is a bit of a small road up to it. On TV or the cinema show reels at the time, everything looked huge, larger than life, far more fascinating. It's a bit like this particular story, all about the Little Princesses by Marion Crawford. Crawfie, yes, the infamous governess of the then Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret Rose. She was the governess for many years from 1933 onwards. And many people know the story because she was probably one of the very first scandalous people, if you like, to spill the beans. Now you have to remember that at this point, Wallis and David, Edward, whatever you want to call him, also capitalised on this. Remind you of anybody? And they capitalised on this because they said, well, look, she spilled the beans. Now, what a lot of people don't realise is that Marion Crawford had a very tough life. And also the husband, shall we say, and allegedly, was a very difficult customer. And many suggest that it was him that forced that particular directive. They needed money, and what better, you know, her time in the royals had gone off. Queen Mary had given her as a, you know, wonderful gesture of her time, Nottingham Cottage, which eventually became Meghan and Harry's home, right? As a thing that she could live in as a grace and favour for her kindness. Now, you didn't cross Queen Mary. And the thing is, this is where the story gets interesting. The idea that they want to do is pick up not the governess stuff, but pick it up from the time of when Marion Crawford did the book and crossed Queen Mary, and take it from there. Now, everybody talks about the fact that nobody ever spoke to Marion Crawford again, even though she lived near Balmoral and they went past her house and the door on a regular basis, nobody ever stopped. Apparently, both Elizabeth and Margaret did want to make, you know, amends, reconcile, even though she lived until 1988. But this is the story, you see, and this is where it gets interesting. Also, the bigger side of it is that nobody wanted, even in death, to offend Queen Mary. She was such a powerful, magnetic person. And there was no way that Queen Elizabeth, as she was then, was going to upset her, you know, because obviously, now as we know, Queen Mary passed away just ahead of the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953. But she'd stipulated that should I go before that, everything carries on the same, don't mourn about me, move it on, the monarchy has to survive. And the downside of that was, I think, according to this source at least, that if Elizabeth and Margaret had have reached out and that got into the public domain, it would have affected a lot of relationships within the monarchy. So when you look at this now, and potentially, as I say, Netflix as a streaming company are looking at that particular area and wondering if they can develop this into some sort of historical event like Downton Abbey. I don't know about you, what would you do? Because obviously, you know, if that person's been very influential in your life, you wouldn't want to cross them. But consequently, you might think in the fullness of time, maybe things weren't as bad as they were painted out. You understand how these things work. I'd love to know what you think to this story because, as I say, early development stages right now, but could come into a full TV series like The Crown, or indeed a one-off feature-length film, something of that level. But that's what's going on behind the scenes of your royal history today. Neil Shaw in Kensington, London.